Washington Journal continues.
Well, joining us now at the table, Jessica Herrera-Flanigan, former staff director and general counsel for the House Homeland Security Committee, also a fellow now at the Center for National Policy. The topic, cybersecurity. Lots of action in Congress in the last several weeks and months, but coming to the House floor this week. Before we get to that, when we talk about cybersecurity, what exactly are we talking about?
I think that's a good question. I'm not sure everyone knows what it means, and there's still a lot of debate, and that's part of what you're seeing play out this week and over the last couple of months, and what will continue to play out probably over the next couple of months. I think there are different definitions, but what we're talking about this week is really cybersecurity in terms of protecting our critical infrastructures within the country. So we're talking about protecting the chemical facilities, the smart grid, the electrical grids more generally, those things that operate and make us run our nation essentially.
So when the House starts its action this week, where does it start? It's a really big topic here. What are they focusing on right now?
There are going to be 4 bills that are up. The most important bill that's actually going to go under a rule and be considered is called the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, and that's coming out of the House Intelligence Committee. What that bill does is allow for the sharing of cyber threat classified information from NSA and the intelligence agencies with the private sector, with some of the critical infrastructures we were talking about, as well as with others who are helping protect the infrastructure from cybersecurity. So that's going to be the key bill. It does that as well as allowing the sharing of information from the private sector to the federal government with liability protections, and allows those entities to also protect their own systems.
So give us the history, the recent history. Why is a bill like this needed?
Going back 20 years, we've been looking for ways to how do you share the information the government knows about the threats that are out there, whether it be from foreign nation or terrorists, with the private sector. The private sector doesn't necessarily have that information. Likewise, the government doesn't run or operate critical infrastructures, so it needs to have information on what's going on in the real world. And there's been a confusion about how do you share this information? What do you do about it? And so this is a way to try to facilitate that. We've been trying for a while, it hasn't worked, and here's a new way of doing it.
The main bill that you first mentioned, who are the main sponsors of this one?
Mike Rogers from Michigan and Dutch Ruppersberger from Maryland.
So there are several other bills as
Correct.
well this week. Can you describe those?
Sure. There's a bill by Mike McCall from Texas, which would look at research and development efforts, trying to facilitate the National Science Foundation's efforts to do cyber workforce research and development, and also just increase our workforce efforts within the federal government. There's a bill by Representative Ralph Hall, which would deal with research and development more on the scientific side. So looking at R&D and networking and IT scientific systems. It's really not a cyber bill per se, but it's expanding an existing program to cybersecurity. Then there's a bill by Representative Issa from California that deals with information security within the federal government. There's a law out there called FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management Act, which is a very technical, archaic law in many ways, and this would be FISMA 2.0. Let's fix all those problems that weren't really fixed with FISMA the first time around.
We'll talk about the Senate a little bit later, but once all this action in the House on cybersecurity is done, what happens? Do these get rolled into a single bill? What will the product be that the House will put out?
I think after this week, what you'll see is a rule and the bill, the Rogers bill, go forward under that and possibly pass. There are some concerns about that we can talk about in a minute. The other 3 bills will just go on suspension, and then it's likely they'll be sent over as a package to the Senate, but that's still being debated, I think, as this week unfolds.
Let's put the phone numbers on the bottom of the screen for our guest, Jessica Herrera-Flanigan. We have separate lines for Republicans, Democrats, Independents. Again, quite an active week this week, at least in the House, in the area of cybersecurity. We'll get to your calls in just a moment, because we're sure there's a lot of interesting questions out there. But speak to us about the pushback. Who may not like what's going on the House floor this week?
Well, the Mike Rogers bill that I was talking about, the CISPA is the shortened version of the name. There are a lot of privacy and civil liberties concerns. The privacy and civil liberties groups, as well as several leading Democrats, including the House Homeland Security ranking member Benny Thompson, has raised concerns about it, partially because of the information sharing that might happen between the private sector and NSA. There's some concern that the information that's being given will go straight to the intelligence agencies, and that essentially you're creating an opportunity to create surveillance on domestic citizens that NSA and others aren't allowed to do.
So how are those concerns being followed up upon?
There have been some adjustments to the bill over the last month, or last week, I should say, including trying to strengthen the privacy and civil liberties provisions within the bill. There have also been attempts to make sure that it relates specifically to cybersecurity as opposed to any purpose. But that hasn't satisfied many of the critics out there.
They're trying. Here's one headline in CQ. Democrats seek to shape agenda as cybersecurity bills head to House floor. And the action begins when? Tomorrow? Maybe Wednesday?
It begins tomorrow.
You can watch it live here on C-SPAN. We will touch on the Senate, of course, as time goes on, but we want to get the callers involved in this conversation. Hunter is on the independent line from Redding, California, quite early out there. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for weighing in. Go ahead.
No problem. It took a while. I just wanted to ask Ms. Herrera about the NSA building that's being almost completed in Utah, and how she feels about that in terms of civil liberties. I have a love-hate relationship with it. I think it's important, but also it's a little bit scary that every single solitary beam originating on Earth that goes to a satellite and becomes back to Earth is going to be cataloged and collected. And my basic thing is, as an American, I've traveled the world, and I've seen a lot of projects get completely out of hand, as this Afghanistan thing is doing. And my basic question is, how does she feel, or how does one feel in the climate of D.C. about the NSA construction of that huge building, which has 425,000 square foot rooms of servers that will collect all data?
Thanks, Hunter. We do get the point. Let's hear from our guest.
I am not familiar with the building being built. One thing I can say about the NSA is its policies are such, and it's been set up so that it goes, its surveillance efforts are supposed to be on the international front. They're not supposed to be doing surveillance on domestic individuals. And any efforts along those lines, whether they're buildings here or Maryland or wherever it may be, I think are to further those efforts and ensure that we have the latest information against threats, whatever threats they may be around the world.
Meadville, Pennsylvania. Warren, Democrat. Good morning.
Hello. My question isn't about this cyber question right now, but it does ask the Department of Homeland Security, why is it they have placed an order for 450 million rounds of 40 caliber hollow point bullets? What need would the Department of Homeland Security have for that and not the U.S. Army?
Something you could speak to?
I can, actually.
Go ahead.
One of the things I think people forget about the Department of Homeland Security is it has a very important law enforcement mission. It has a number of entities that are engaged on the law enforcement side, including the Secret Service, the Border Patrol, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. All these entities are doing important criminal and law enforcement efforts both along the border and within the interior. And so any weapons that they may be obtaining is in advancement of that effort.
Tyler, Texas. Chuck, Republican, you're on the air.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to ask your guest about the Center for National Policy and what kind of impact groups like that have on the policy of the United States government.
Well, the Center for National Policy is a think tank that looks at a lot of the international and strategic issues that are happening both in the national security front and the foreign affairs front. I think a lot of the think tanks, they do a variety of things. They hold events in which discussions are held. They speak out, write papers, and I think their role in the policy making is to offer somewhat unbiased views of foreign policy and international issues.
To cybersecurity, the topic for the segment here. House debates coming up this week, which you can watch on C-SPAN. Speak to us more about the civil liberties concerns and how the debate will play out on the floor this week.
I think what will likely happen is there will be a Democratic amendment that takes the position of adding more privacy and civil liberties protections to the bill, the CISPA bill that's being offered.
What kinds do you think?
In particular, I think one of the things that people have talked about is rather than sharing information directly with the intelligence agencies, sending it to the Department of Homeland Security as the civilian agency. That's been a big debate that's going on. There was one bill that didn't make it to the floor this week. That was a bill offered by Representative Lundgren of the House Homeland Security Committee that would deal with Homeland Security as the lead on cybersecurity. And it would also offer somewhat of a voluntary standards process for critical infrastructure protection. That bill didn't make it. There's a lot of controversy over whether or not you want a regulatory scheme and whether DHS should have a leading role. And I think that's going to play out in the amendment process.
What is the White House's view on everything right now, cybersecurity-wise?
The White House was rather supportive of the Lundgren approach that didn't make it to the floor. It has raised concerns with the CISPA bill that is going to be on the floor, partially because of the privacy and civil liberties concerns, also because of the lack of a sufficient role for DHS in the bill. There is a role for DHS in the bill, but it is an intelligence bill, and it's looking more on the intelligence side of things, and I think there's been some concern that that may be, if that's the only bill moving, that there's something lacking. Our
guest is Jessica Herrera-Flanigan, former staff director and general counsel at the House Homeland Security Committee. The years were 2005 through 2008. She is now a fellow at the Center for National Policy. We have a call from Dave. It's from Bradenton, Florida, independent caller. Hi, Dave.
Hi, how are you today?
Doing fine.
Listen, my question may be off a little bit, topic that you guys are talking about, but, Homeland Security, to me, is not Afghanistan and Iraq. The Homeland Security should be more worried about Mexico and things that are happening on the America, continents instead of what's going on over there, and Middle East and the over there in the Far East.
I think we get the point.
I think.
Go ahead and finish up, Dave.
Pardon me?
Go ahead and finish up.
Okay, I think we ought to be worried more about what's happening in Mexico and what's right on the other side of our borders.
I think he's repeating his point. We'll go on to Joe in Portsmouth, Rhode Island now, Democrat. Good morning. Joe, are you there? One more time for Joe, Portsmouth, Rhode Island. How about Sandy, Pittsburgh?
Yes. I have a question about cybersecurity and employment. I have a son who just graduated from college. He's got $35,000 in debt, very computer-oriented. What opportunities can cybersecurity give to the young people coming out of college? Where can they go to apply for jobs, and what kind of jobs are there? Where can they go to apply and give the young people some inroads to how can they get a job in this field, cybersecurity, and where do they go?
Thanks for calling.
Cybersecurity is actually one of the biggest job creators right now, and will continue to be as people look at ways to take new innovative technologies and apply cybersecurity to those technologies. The federal government has been looking to hire a number of cybersecurity experts. One of the bills this week actually talks, the Mike McCall bill actually talks about workforce development and trying to get more cybersecurity experts on board. In addition to the federal government, there are a number of defense contractors and IT companies that are looking for cybersecurity experts.
Broaden this topic of cybersecurity out just a little bit, because it is quite broad. You mentioned what's happening in the House specifically this week, but when we talk about cybersecurity, we're talking about a lot of other entities here. Can you give us the full scope?
I mean, so we're focused on right now the critical infrastructure, cybersecurity. Another element of this that's probably going to affect more Americans on the day-to-day basis is really data security and data breach. What happens when your information is stolen? I think all of us have received, if you do any shopping online, you've received an email saying that your information may have been compromised, because there have been a lot of companies that have been affected by various hacking groups out there stealing information, and just people overall, not even hacking groups, just individuals doing the same.
We have a call from Northway Plains, New York now. It's John, Democrat. Good morning, John.
Good morning. Good morning, Ms. Flanigan.
Good morning.
I have a question in relation to what you said earlier about real-time or real-life secure information, especially for high-level governmental institutions. The cyberspace or internet the exchange of secure information has been in use, I would venture to say, at least since the 80s, definitely in the 90s, and of course in the 2000s and so on. And my question, which may be more of a comment, is a little askew because it always puzzled me why Donald Rumsfeld came out and said during 911, we did not have the TV on, as if he couldn't have access to secure information. The Pentagon, it's the Department of Defense, they don't make sneakers. That has always puzzled me why he said that. We didn't have the TV on, that's why we weren't ready or prepared for that third or fourth plane. And I'm sure cyberspace was in effect then. I know it was. So do you have any comments? Basically my comment, but do you have any answer, or can you explain why he may have said that? Thank you.
I'm not familiar with that comment, so unfortunately I don't think I can comment on that.
So we have to move this over to the Senate because, as we know, there's a lot of House action this week, but there's this headline in the Hill this morning. House gears up for what they're calling Cyber Week, but the security bill's fate rests with the Senate. So take us over to the other side. What is percolating over there in this area?
Well, we've had a bill that's been hanging around since last year, if not even before to last Congress. The main bill in the Senate that's being considered is a Lieberman-Collins bill that takes a more comprehensive approach to cybersecurity. Rather than having 3 or 4 small bills, there's one big bill. It does a lot of the things that we've talked about. It does have an information sharing section, not quite the same as the CISPA one, but it does have one. And more importantly, it has a section that looks a lot like the Lundgren bill in terms of a critical infrastructure voluntary standards section that would allow for the federal government to help critical infrastructures through voluntary standards reach some type of agreement on how to protect systems. And that's been what's controversial, and that's what's held up the bill since it was originally going to be considered in January and February. They've been trying to resolve that. There's been some, even though it's a bipartisan bill, there's been some Republican pushback. Senator McCain actually offered an alternative bill that took out that section and did a few other minor things. And they've been in discussions to try to resolve that issue, and they haven't been able to do that yet.
Here is another piece from Senator Lieberman. This is during one of our Communicators programs, which runs on the weekend and on Mondays on the networks, talked about the cybersecurity legislation that he and Senator Snowe are putting forth.
The goal, simply stated, is to protect all that we Americans have in cyberspace from being stolen and from being attacked. And the theft is going on thousands of times every day, most of which people are not aware of. That is to say, people some from inside, mostly from outside the country, actually going into the internet systems, the computer systems of companies, and stealing industrial intellectual property, and then taking it and building the stuff that American companies spent millions or billions of dollars to develop, which also takes a lot of jobs from America. The other thing where the aim of the legislation is to protect all of the cyber structure in America that's privately owned from becoming targets of an enemy wanting to attack us. So what am I talking about? The electric power grid, the transportation systems, the financial systems. So this is all very vulnerable now, and probably if there was a major conflict, an enemy would come at us first by cyber attack, and we're simply not adequately defended.
So to our guest, a little bit more from the Hill. A Democratic aide does say that this Lieberman-Collins bill is a priority for the Senate Majority Leader Reid. We expect to take up the legislation in the next few weeks, they write here, but it is unclear whether there are enough votes. So how do they get past John McCain's issues and concerns with the bill?
I think there's some interest in seeing what happens in the House this week. And if the House puts forward a collected group of bills and sends it over to the Senate, that obviously will increase the pressure on the Senate. I think the general thinking is the first or second week of May, they will try to move a bill forward on the floor, regardless of where the support may be, and leave it to be an open amendment process and see what amendments come up. And if there are amendments that come up, you may see things like data breach and data notification address, supply chain, some of the intellectual property issues.
They also point out in the Hill that the powerful U.S. Chamber of Commerce is also lobbying against Lieberman-Collins. Yep. Where's the White House on the Senate bill?
The White House has been supportive of the Lieberman-Collins bill. It addresses some of their major concerns, including the critical infrastructure protection standards provisions, and that's been something that's of interest, and I think that's one of the things the White House thinks is necessary at this point.
Let's hear from Gainesville, Florida. Jeff, Republican.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for C-SPAN. I was wondering about Homeland Security in the when it was established, and how many employees does it have, and what do they do? I mean, since 2006, I believe I read where the government has a million more employees, and what do they do? I mean, why is there a need for it when we have the FBI, we have National Guard? What's the need for it? I understand the need for protecting the internet and the government and everything, but what's the need for all these employees, and what are they doing?
Let's hear from our guest.
Well, I can tell you that the 1 million jobs created, not all of them are at the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11. It came into existence in early 2003. There are various components of it. A lot of the components came from other places, trying to put together in one location an effort to counter what happened on 9/11 and ensure that we have the protection, prevention, and recovery mechanisms all in one place. So among the entities that went to the Department of Homeland Security were Customs and Border Protection, so protecting the border, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, and that's dealing with undocumented workers and illegal immigration. The cybersecurity efforts, larger critical infrastructure protection, so protecting buildings. The Secret Service, the Coast Guard, FEMA, so recovering from emergency situations, whether they be created by terrorist acts or natural disasters. And also TSA, so aviation security. Those are the major components. There are other pieces of it, but they're all in one place so that we can try to take a uniform, all-hazards approach to Homeland Security.
You had mentioned the electric grid. One viewer via Twitter asks, says there's no incentive for any one private company to upgrade the grid, so none do.
That's been one of the criticisms levied by the White House, saying that we don't want to get into a regulatory scheme, which is a concern that many of the Republicans have had, but that we need to have some kind of voluntary process in place so that entities can try to upgrade their systems. For the smart grid, there's actually some requirements in law that there be some cybersecurity provisions, though it's not clear what those may be. And so this is a way to try to move the ball forward and do things, though it's a fine line to draw between what you do and how do you become over-regulatory. And some of the concerns raised by the companies is if we do put standards into place, will it become overburdensome and will it not allow us to keep being innovative? So there's that struggle that's going on and how we look at the issue.
We have Tim on the line, Chelsea, Michigan, Democrat. Good morning, Tim.
Hey, how's it going?
Fine. How you doing?
Good. Thank you for taking my call. My concern is that Homeland Security, and this is just overdrawn, overrated, another police agency. We have enough security, I think. I think we should be more pushing for more peace instead of more police, more prisons. We're the highest prison population in the world. We have more children in prison than any other people in the world. I mean, when do we have enough is enough?
Well, I think one of the things to remember about the Homeland Security Department is an important part of its mission is prevention. So it's to avoid the next 9/11 attack. And when such an attack does occur, how do we recover from it in an effective manner? So it's part of its mission is on the protection side with some of its components like the Secret Service and the Customs and Border Protection, but some of it's really about preventing and recovery from terrible things.
Say in Augustine, Florida, Vicki, Republican, good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling because yesterday I watched C-SPAN's coverage of the Los Angeles book festival, and there was a lady on who talked about her book called I Know Who You Are and I Saw What You Did. Her last name is Andrews, and she made a comment about Homeland Security possibly making efforts at some point where they feel threatened to slow down the internet so that people cannot access as quickly or get on as fast, and I wondered if the lady could comment about that.
I have not heard of that happening. There's been some discussion of what happens in an emergency on how do we assure that ability to get on the internet or get on telecommunications systems are made in such a way that the first responders have priority, but that's been a discussion. I've not heard that the department's actually tried to slow down the network and keep people from getting on. If anything, the U.S. has taken a position that internet liberty and freedoms is important. They've actually fought against other nations and have spoken out when other nations, especially during the Arab Spring uprisings last year, have tried to slow down or keep their citizens from speaking out and getting on networks.
Tucson, Arizona. Rick, Independent, good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to get the views of your guests with regard to civil liberties and privacy, specifically as it applies to the dual hatting of the director of NSA, as also the commander of Cybercom, the co-location of U.S. Cybercom with NSA, and also the fact that that staff is predominantly intelligence officers. How do you make that separation, given that they now have access, particularly at the moment, to the military and some private sector information that is circumventing the laws associated with intelligence communities?
Let's hear from Jessica Herrera-Flanigan.
Well, I think part of the cybersecurity mission, part of it is with the Department of Homeland Security, and that's looking at some of the domestic issues and working with the private sector. But there's also another important part of that, and what are our nations overseas doing? Cyber threats, the NSA and the military has an important role to play, and it's important not to forget that. Some of our cyber threats are coming from foreign nations. We know, for example, that some of the worst offenders in terms of stealing information from both our government systems and our private systems are coming from nations like China and Russia. So we need to have a role for the NSA, for the intelligence community, and for the Department of Defense to counter such efforts, to learn what our opponents may be doing, and also to counter whatever cyber terrorists might be doing. And those are not necessarily nations, but rogue groups or terrorist organizations, and there is an important role to play there. The question is, where do those lines get drawn, and where do we then allow for the domestic side, the Department of Homeland Security, some of the Commerce Department, or the FTC to take a role?
Lots of mentions about Homeland Security. Give us a broad sense of the resources devoted to this area of cybersecurity in this government.
This government?
Yeah.
The Department of Homeland Security actually has a cybersecurity section. It has an Assistant Secretary of Cybersecurity that looks at both cybersecurity and national communications issues. That's within a division called the NPPD, the National Protection and Division. And that's run by a gentleman named Rand Beers. And so they look at both the physical security efforts, so efforts at the chemical facilities, ensuring that there are fences around and other security measures, and then also the cyber side of things. So that's one area. That group at the Department of Homeland Security actually works very closely with the private sector as well as with the Department of Defense. So at the Department of Defense and the NSA, you have as the last questioner asked, there is a section there looking at issues. Within the Department of Justice, you have a cybercrime division that looks at the criminal side of things. Various other agencies have divisions that look at cybersecurity from their perspective.
And remind us again, who are the experts in Congress on this topic?
I think right now you have a few experts. In the intelligence side, Mike Rogers and Detro Pressburger have really taken a lead on looking at what the NSA is doing. On the Homeland Security side, you've had several. You have Lieberman and Collins, who we mentioned earlier, and then on the House side, you had Dan Lundgren, who we've mentioned, Yvette Clarke, who's the ranking member of the Cybersecurity Subcommittee in House Homeland. You also have Peter King and Benny Thompson, who are the chairman and ranking member of the House Homeland Security Committee, full committee. And then there's also a cybersecurity caucus where you have Mike McCall, who we mentioned earlier, and Jim Langevin, who are the caucus co-chairs. And then one other person who's been very active on the House side has been Mac Thornberry, a congressman from Texas who actually was in charge of a cybersecurity task force and has been engaged on these issues since the beginning of the House Homeland Security Committee back in 2002.
And give us a sense of how big this issue is going to get in the years to come.
Well, to the degree that every single one of us has a smartphone, has an internet-connected television, uses computer technologies to run our everyday lives, and then you have all the critical infrastructures, the banking, the financial industries, the electric grids that we talked about earlier, the telecom industries, all relying on cyber and internet to kind of deliver their services. It's going to be huge.
Fort Wayne, Indiana. Wayne calling, Democrat. Good morning.
Yes, what I'd like to know is that although Homeland Security is ostensibly to protect us from threats outside, most of the actions taken are against American citizens. That's like the SIPA, where they get to spy on American citizens rather than to actually find the terrorists from outside.
Let's hear from our guest.
I think the Department of Homeland Security is actually looking across the board. It's not spying on individuals per se. It's looking for the terrorists. Unfortunately, we don't know what the terrorists look like. So we have to take a very cautionary but comprehensive approach to looking for those who are wishing us ill within our borders and without.
We have Lonnie, Florence, Alabama, Independent. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to know what this going to cost and how much you make in a year.
Tell us about the cost. We talked about the scope of the cybersecurity effort. How much money is being spent? Do you have a sense?
I think billions of dollars are being spent. Some of it's on the intelligence side, so we don't know the exact numbers, but estimates had said that cybersecurity spending is in the billions of dollars, and that's to protect all of our systems. That's to develop new technologies, because one of the things we have to remember is as innovation changes and technology changes, we have to change how we protect those systems. Now, that's how much it may cost us, but if we don't do anything on cybersecurity, the cost can range to the billions to trillions of dollars. So it's a problem that has to be addressed. If we don't address it, it will, and think about how much it costs to just deal with identity theft and the billions of dollars being spent to try to prevent that. That's an important that's an important aspect that we have to look at when we look at the cost.
What are companies, especially the biggest companies, doing in this area right now?
A lot of the biggest companies have cybersecurity experts on board. They have to protect their own networks. Companies that have personally identifiable information, so any company that stores information because they're on you or me or whoever else, they have units that are just looking at fraud and abuse. More and more companies are going to have to be engaged because of the theft of intellectual property, especially as we see certain foreign nations decide that they would like to try to steal our intellectual property and ideas. So I think almost every company out there is trying to gauge how do they protect their assets, how do they protect the information of their customers.
Explain the intersection then between the corporate world and the government with this area of cybersecurity.
Well, one of the ways right now we have is the Department of Homeland Security with regards to the critical infrastructures. That's where we focus the government effort so far. And that's with the banking industry, the telecom industry. There are information sharing mechanisms in place. We've also created ISACs, which are information sharing advisory groups that companies within a sector, so you may have all the banking entities talk to each other and talk about the threats that are happening so they can share that information and try to protect themselves. We see a lot of those groups participating.
Our guest is a graduate of Yale and Harvard. Jessica Herrera-Flanigan is a former staff director and general counsel for the House Homeland Security Committee, 2005 to 2008. Currently a fellow at the Center for National Policy. CNPONline.org is the website there, Center for National Policy. Avenel, New Jersey, Deepak, Democrat. Thank you for waiting.
Yes. I'm wondering if Congress is doing something to legalize the small training for the software testers and the other kind of software training. I have seen a lot of foreign, Asian, and Indian, they're getting jobs here by getting a 6-month training and submitting the fake resume. And other people are giving interviews on their behalf and getting commission, and they getting paid $50, $60 an hour just by having a small degree and submitting taking a small contract. So if Congress is doing something to legalize some kind of software tester training or any kind of software training so Americans can get job here?
So there are a number of efforts going on to try to increase domestically the education efforts, like in STEM efforts, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, so that people here, students basically in college, can learn and try to focus on those efforts to increase our workforce on the science and technology side, including the software side. There have also been some efforts on the high-skilled immigration side of things, both to ensure that we have the number of workers that we need. So people who are educated here that come from foreign countries, so that we don't just educate them and then send them away to compete against us. So we're looking at ways to improve that. But there are also efforts underway to ensure that fraud isn't occurring. And there's been a lot of discussion over the past week about fraud within certain immigration groups or companies and how to address that. And so I think Congress is taking those issues very seriously. They're not moving very quickly on legislation, but they are looking at ways to address those issues.
Here's another question via Twitter. Does the bill make a distinction between a cyber attack and cyber activism?
It does not. They don't get into that specificity. A lot of what it discusses is really protecting the networks, so it's less focused on the attack and more focused on the threats more broadly.
Let's hear from Dallas now. Russell, Independent. Good morning, Russell.
Hello.
Hi there. Is this Russell?
No, this isn't. This is Bonnie Cameron.
Well, we're glad to have you. Go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to make a comment on the Homeland Security. I think that they're spending too much money on that because they are infringing on us, the United States citizens. They came to my house telling me that my husband couldn't write a letter to the president on the way he felt of what he was doing with his job, and refused to give us ID, showed us his gun. I think that was very wrong. And nobody would listen to us about what they were doing. Now, I don't think that that's right for Homeland Security.
Thanks for calling. Something you want to respond to?
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with the circumstances, so I don't think I can really respond to that.
Let's go to Phoenix then. Peg, Democrat.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I read on Sunday's paper that some German scientists had just come up with a new research that they had done, which basically was about being able to hack-proof any internet connections, and it was a very technical article about something about lining up atoms or splitting them, and that if any third party came in, somehow that communication would be non-existent. Do you know anything about these German researchers and this new attempt to secure cyberspace?
Thanks, caller.
I've read a little bit about that, and I've read about others who have tried similar things. Unfortunately, I think the only way to make something hack-proof is to disconnect it from the internet. Computers are much like locks. There's always going to be someone who can pick a lock. There's not a lock that's pick-proof. And there may be some that are close, and that's the truth, I think, also with the internet and some of the anti-hacking efforts that are out there. But it's a constant game of trying to keep up with the automation that's going on, with assuring that you're constantly looking at the network and seeing who's trying to get in and how to prevent them, and once they get in, how to get them out.
Back to the Hill itself. So we know the House this week. The Senate might have its bill in the next couple of weeks. What kind of timetable is there to put the pieces together on this?
Well, it has to be pretty quickly because Congress is actually going to be very busy coming this summer, and then they're going to be busy with the election. So if the House does its effort this week and the Senate's able to do their effort in May, I think you'll see quick movement. The question is, will the Senate be able to get off the efforts that it's had so far and actually go forward? There is a passage in a CQ piece that says Congressman Thornberry of Texas said that added bills could come to the House floor in the near future. This week's slate of legislation is only the start. Can you give us a preview of what else might be coming? Sure. I mean, there's still discussions about whether the Lundgren bill, it was scaled down in committee last week, so some of the critical infrastructure voluntary standard language was removed. There's some question about whether that bill will move forward. Other bills that are kind of in the hopper include a potential data breach bill that would deal with preemption issues, so you don't have 50 states putting out their own laws dealing with data breach and how you're supposed to be notified when someone steals your information. There is a secure grid bill that's being considered in the Energy and Commerce Committee that may come out. And then also looking at some of the cybercrime provisions. Do we have strong enough laws on the cybercrime side of things so that we can go after the bad guys when they commit acts here in the U.S.?
Last couple of calls for our guest, Chapel Hill, Tennessee. Kelly, Independent, welcome.
This is Tony from Chapel Hill.
Oh, go ahead, Tony.
Okay, thank you. Look, I have two real concerns. For one thing, initially when they started Homeland Security, I don't know if that brings back a Nazi reference to anyone, but they need to think about this. And also, when they retroactively allow AT&T or any other communications company that handles the internet to retroactively be innocent of the crimes that they've already committed, this is step by step the new SS or the new Gestapo of America that's going to be happening in about 15 to 20 years. And she said there was going to be a lot of small bills, but this would be one big bill. The reason it's one big bill is to confuse everybody and not bring the real issues out. And if you think that American newspapers and media are actually going to tell us anything at all,
It's a drain.
One caller's perspective there. Any thoughts?
Well, I will say that the liability protections that are in the bill are not retroactive. Essentially, what they've intended to do is if the government shares information with a company and the company acts on that information, cyber threat information, and something goes awry, that company has some protections because they listened to what the government said. That's the liability protections that are in the Mike Rogers bill. That bill is 18 pages. I think if you take the 4 or 5 bills, the longest bill is 18 pages long. So there's an 18-page and then shorter bills for the other 4 that are being considered.
So does that mean somewhat easy to understand, if that's the right word?
They're not easy to understand because some of the language is broad, and that's where the privacy and civil liberties concerns have come in.
Got it. Last call here, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. David, Democrat. Good morning.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I really enjoyed the previous show with Brian Lamb, Q&A with Douglas Wissing. DouglasWissing.com for people that missed it can find information on it. I think that we're wasting tremendous amounts of money in Afghanistan, and 2,000 service people dying, tens of thousands injured. The people we've almost destroyed their water system that they need for irrigation and just being alive with this random, unsynchronized well drilling. If we're going to stay there, I hope we can improve their water system. And when we say stay there, it's not combat troops. If we're going to continue to give them aid, let's give them aid that they can use, not that global corporations can come in and
Caller, let me jump in. We're talking cybersecurity here. Can you bring your comments over to that area if possible?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm watching. I came in to comment on the Afghan.
Got it. We're on a cybersecurity segment now. Afghanistan was our earlier segment. We are just about out of time, so wrap this up for us. Final legislation. What's your guess, if that's the right word, on what this might be able to look like based on the factions that are out there?
I think you will see some type of information sharing between the federal government and the private sector. Whether that's intelligence-led or DHS-led is still unclear. But that's assuming the House and Senate get together. You'll see a lot of R&D efforts, a lot of workforce training. How do we develop a cybersecurity workforce? That's uncontroversial. There may be some efforts to try to put all of cybersecurity under one leadership, whether it be at the White House or the Department of Homeland Security. That's still being debated. The critical infrastructure voluntary standards language, it's going to be harder to say what happens with that given the opposition.
Jessica Herrera-Flanigan, former staff director and general counsel at the House Homeland Security Committee, also fellow currently at the Center for National Policy. Thanks for your time and insight this morning.
Thank you, Paul.
A couple of other guests this morning on Washington Journal coming up in a couple of minutes. Spencer Hsu of the Washington Post will join us. Big several-part series recently on forensic errors here in the United States. We'll explain what that means and what the impact is around the country. We'll also talk later with David Givens of Argus Media. The topic there will be your money, specifically the Bureau of Federal Land Management, how much is being spent, what this bureau does, and all about the work it does. In the meantime, some news now from C-SPAN Radio.
It's 8:32 a.m. Eastern Time. Congressional committees are widening their investigations into an alleged U.S. Secret Service scandal involving prostitutes in Colombia ahead of a trip there by the president. In remarks earlier on NBC's Today Show, New York Republican Peter King, chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, says he's confident that the investigation is moving forward as countless agents interview hotel maids and women involved in the incident and other Secret Service employees in Colombia. He went on to say, quote, "I think we expect in the next day or so to see several more agents being forced to leave." Britain's broadcast regulator says it's investigating email hacking at Rupert Murdoch's Sky News channel. A spokesman for the regulator Ofcom says that the inquiry follows the news station's admission that it authorized journalists to hack into people's email accounts on 2 separate occasions. Sky News insists that the computer breaches were carried out in the public interest. News Corporation head Rupert Murdoch and his son James will be testifying before an inquiry committee Tuesday through Thursday of this week. Hear live coverage on C-SPAN Radio beginning at 5 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. And U.S. stock futures are lower this morning as political uncertainty in Europe raises new questions about how effectively the debt crisis is being handled. German manufacturing shrinking at its fastest pace in nearly 3 years, and the first round of the French presidential election just some of what's contributing to that uncertainty. The situation having an effect on Wall Street ahead of the opening bell. Dow